So you might wonder sometimes, when I talk about paths, I talk about methods, talk about techniques, and then you also hear me sometimes talk about no path, no technique, no one to walk the path, etc. That could tie up the mind, could lead to a question that says, well, which one's right? Because it has to be this one or that one, right? It's got to be A or B, because A can't be B and B can't be A. Bodhidharma can't have a beard and not have a beard simultaneously, right? That's what the mind says. That's how the mind sees reality. And it's really important that the mind sees reality that way when it comes to things like science or figuring out what kind of fluid to put in the gas tank of your car, or following the steps to bake a cake, putting flour in the cake instead of, say, sawdust, right? So it's important that we have a discerning mind. It's important that we have a mind that knows how to discern what's real from what's unreal in the relative world. But in this pointing, this type of speaking that I'm doing now, I'm not so concerned with the relative world. I'm concerned with a truth about identity. Sometimes we could say this is the absolute reality or the absolute truth. The absolute truth sounds a little off because it's kind of almost insinuating that there's some exact way that things are, and I'm going to tell you what it is. That's not what I mean. It's just absolute in the sense that it has no relative aspect. It's absolute in the sense that it doesn't have parts. It's absolute in the sense that it doesn't come or go. It doesn't have an origin, and it doesn't have a departure. It's absolute in the sense that there's nothing apart from it. There's nothing outside of it. It's absolute in the sense that there is no inside and no outside. So this is what I mean by absolute. So when I'm pointing in the way I do in these videos, I'm not trying to make a relative statement. I'm not trying to convince you that this is the right way and that's the wrong way, or vice versa. The words are really only for the moment. The words are a kind of alchemical offering, or we could say they're a catalyst, potentially. It doesn't mean they always will be, but there will be times that something about the sequence of words, something about the cadence of the words in that moment will unlock something, cause something to flip over, cause something to disappear, cause the ground beneath your feet to suddenly be realized to be nothing but empty space. So that's the kind of goal of all of this. When you recognize that what I'm talking about doesn't have anything to do with categories, it's not this or that, then it opens up a whole bunch of possibilities. So for instance, if I were to tell you that you can abide where there is no perception, but there's also not an absence of perception. You can abide where there is no self to be found, but it's also not a state of selflessness. I can say that you will find no actual self-structure. You'll find no container for experience. You will find no continuous entity or continuous experiencing substance or background. I can say all of those things. I can make all those pointers or make all of those comments or statements, and it will point attention a certain way, or it may direct the mind a certain way. But it can go too far with this too. The mind can ultimately feel some of that freedom, feel some of that unbinding by hearing these statements, but then it can start to reify or solidify the statements into something else, into another sort of position, another view. It may be a more subtle view. It may be a more flexible view. It may be a more accommodating view. Probably most importantly, and when I say most importantly here, I mean most importantly as to why it's potentially deluding, causes delusion, is that when we reify these sort of extreme pointers, extreme from the standpoint of the mind-identified world of collective delusion, when we reify these more, I guess, extreme or more outside the usual types of statements or orientations, like no self. There is no self. There is no separation. There is no form. These kinds of statements, when we reify those, the reason it works well to give let's just say the remaining ego, a nice place to settle into, is actually because they don't really have a framework. They don't have a normal place in the matrix. So they can conveniently fly under the radar and still be functioning in a delusional mechanism, or with a delusional mechanism. So what I'm saying there is, yes, it's very powerful sometimes to realize there's no doer, that agency is an illusion. The one that seems like it's done all the things in your life, you won't find it. You won't find the guilty party. You won't find the one that's made the mistakes. You won't find the one that's struggling. You may find struggle, but you're not going to find the one struggling. Right? It's really freeing sometimes to hear this. And then what can happen is the sneaky mind can come in and say that there's this reality, this fundamental reality, where there's no doer. This fundamental reality that has no doership in it. And that's just the truth. That's how it is. This fundamental reality that has no self, and that's just it. That's how it is. And again, this is very subtle, but it's an identity, or it's an identifying mechanism. We're identifying with a very subtle doctrinal or spiritual principle. But what I'm saying is you can go beyond that. And beyond doesn't have meaning here, of course. But it's the best I can come up with. Let me say this, you can let go of that. So when I say there's no agency, you'll find no agent. Then I also have to add, and you're not going to find a place where no agent exists. So what does that do to your mind, right? How does that bind up the mind, tie up the mind, dissolve the mind, stop the mind? Stop everything. That's the key. And when everything stops, including any reifying principles, tendency to formulate a background, tendency to formulate an inherent existence of anything at all, including formlessness, including awareness, when that stops, well, we can't really talk about what's revealed. It's impossible. There just aren't any words for it. It's not an it. It's not an experience. It's not a place. But it's also not somewhere else. It's not special. But it's not even... it's not even on the spectrum of special and mundane. It doesn't lend itself to spectrums. It doesn't lend itself to patterns of experience or patterns of perception even, right? So when I say, for instance, a common or well-known Buddhist doctrine, a Dharma seal, is essentially impermanence, right? Impermanence as a doctrine. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful pointing to realize all of this is going away. The deeper understanding that nothing even stirs, nothing arises, nothing departs, nothing's coming or going. And then there's an even deeper experience of it that's harder to, not harder, it's impossible to point to, but it's freedom even from the antidote, right? Freedom from the antidote. Freedom from the antidote of doctrine. Doctrine is an antidote. Freedom from the antidote of practices. Practices are antidotes. They're not meaningless or useless, but they're antidotes. You can be free from that antidote. Free from the binding of it. Free from the binding of a belief that there's only formless awareness. Or a belief in the Buddha Dharma. You can be free from the belief in any actually existing position, view, holding space, orientation. This is true freedom. And it won't exclude the relative world at all. It will illuminate the relative world like a 10 million watt light bulb. It will illuminate the relative in ways that are damn near miraculous. But I can't explain this. You just have to go and let go and undermine the belief and keep undermining the beliefs. And then the belief that's settled has settled in once the more gross beliefs have been let go of. You have to undermine that belief. Question it. And a whole lot of feeling into all of this until the luminous sensation fields are what do the work. They do the work of undermining all illusion, all delusion, and it starts to happen rather spontaneously. But there's still a sort of vigilance that's maintained. The vigilance is about not going voluntarily unconscious. Perhaps it's about a very, very deep and profound trust in whatever it was that led you down this unbinding path, even though it's not a what. It's not an entity. It's not an actually existing anything. And yet there's a massive amount of trust in it because it's all of this already. Every sensation that's ever arisen, every sound you've ever heard, all the ecstasy, all the pain, the sorrow, the grief, the joy, the laughter, it's every bit of it. And it doesn't even need to express itself in a temporal world in that way. It doesn't need to express itself in a physical world. It's just as real, if not more real, in the unexpressed, in the unborn. But even then, the unborn is not apart from, separate from, or even distinguishable anymore from the multitude, the 10,000 things. So maybe in the end, Bonke, the Zen master, was right when he said, everything is perfectly managed in the unborn.